Hi everyone, thanks for joining our joint webinar hosted by FullStory and Amplitude. Today we're going to be talking about finding your product's Northstar metric. I'm Hannah Woodburn, Product Marketing Manager here at FullStory, and I'm so excited to be here with Abbie Kouzmanoff from Amplitude and Tommy Noonan from FullStory. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Hannah.
Thanks. So today we're going to talk about how we define Northstar metrics, how to adopt a Northstar metric, and how our panelists track Northstar metrics at their organizations. Before we dive in, I want to give brief bios on both of our panelists. First up is Abbie Kouzmanoff. Abbie is a product manager at Amplitude, where she focuses on helping companies understand their user behavior data to ultimately build better products. She was previously a product manager at Dropbox, where she drove revenue growth for the company through continuous experimentation and optimization. And our other panelist is Tommy Noonan. He's a product manager at FullStory, where he works with a team of engineers and designers on FullStory's core app experience. So Tommy has spent time building FullStory's analytics stack, and in previous roles was a product manager for mobile search at Google and an analytics consultant at Accenture. Thanks for being here, guys. So
yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, definitely. So let's start off setting the stage. So a question for both of you. How do you define a Northstar metric?
Sure, I can go ahead and dive in first. A Northstar metric is really something that any team can rally behind and create alignment. I feel like a Northstar metric is all about creating focus and improving decision making. So as long as you have everybody on the same page or rallied behind a singular metric, that's something that I would consider a Northstar metric.
Nice. Abbie, what about you?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything Tommy said. I think one thing that's kind of unique to a Northstar metric that's really important for us at Amplitude is that it's really a measure between kind of defining the relationship between solving customer pain and finding customer value and revenue. So kind of falls somewhere in between those, where it's a leading indicator of success for your business, but also ties into those input metrics of customer value and solving that customer pain. So it kind of gives that rallying cry that Tommy mentioned for the organization to kind of connect those dots.
Nice. So it sounds like a good product metric or Northstar metric would be one that people can get behind and really rally behind, and it can create consensus. What are some other attributes of a good Northstar metric?
Yeah, I think you kind of said it with that, but it should really be a statement of the company's vision or the product team's vision, and something that the product team can really hold itself accountable to. I think one thing that makes the Northstar really successful is when different people on the team can say, whenever they're working on a new initiative, hey, does this actually impact the Northstar metric that we're all working towards? And if it doesn't, kind of asking yourself why it's important to be working on that initiative. So I think that's really important. One other thing I'd mention, coming back to that customer value, is it really should connect there. So something like daily active users may not be the best metric of a Northstar because it's not really connecting with customer value. If someone's coming back day after day but not really getting value from your product, there may be a risk of churn there for sure. So you want to make sure that it's actually connecting to that value that customers are getting.
Yeah, I love that. Tommy, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I would definitely echo Abbie's sentiment about tracking your Northstar metric to customer value. And, that may not necessarily be daily active users like Abbie mentioned. Maybe weekly active users is fine, or maybe weekly active users that complete a certain task or use case in your app is really what you're looking for. I think at the end of the day, you want to be able to say, how many of my users or accounts are using the app and getting value out of it like they're expecting to when they log in or when they purchase or use your software.
Yeah, that's
other. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say kind of one other thing there too is with that kind of completing that action, it's actually holding your product organization accountable to an outcome. So you're actually being able to measure of, hey, is the product team actually moving these outcomes that we care about? Which can be a scary thing at first, I think, being measured against an outcome versus potentially a ship goal and how many things you're actually getting out the door. But if successful, it can really potentially rally more resources behind your team as well.
Yeah, that's such a great point. For those of you who are just joining, I'm here with Abbie Kouzmanoff from Amplitude and Tommy Noonan from FullStory. We're talking about Northstar metrics. We do have a question box and we'll answer questions at the end. So if any questions come up throughout this webinar, please feel free to type them in. So we talked a little bit about how do you define a North Star metric, what makes it good. But then how do you think of North Star metric within the context of all the other metrics and KPIs that you track as a product manager?
I like the way Abbie was talking about how the North Star metric is something that like everyone is aligned behind, and something that when you begin new projects, like you talk about these projects in terms of how will they move the North Star metric, I guess. So you definitely do not need to only track one metric. I know at FullStory we have our North Star metric, but then we like to break out into what are the 5 or 6 other metrics that are actually components of the North Star metric. So if you have a weekly active user that needs to complete a certain task, those are 2 obvious components of it. And so tracking like the percentages and the ratios between how these different things build up to a North Star metric can be super helpful in terms of operationalizing or just connecting all of your metrics together and learning how they, I guess, funnel up to the North Star. If you ever have metrics that you think are completely unrelated to the North Star, I'd say that sometimes is like a red flag to me of being like, is this really something that matters, or is this something that I should devote a lot of my time to? But certainly you can review those on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the North Star metric is kind of, it's a leading indicator to revenue, which obviously you should be tracking as well. But if revenue related metric is your North Star, that potentially poses some risk, because you'll find out about revenue after you kind of already lost the chance to fix it. So for example, if you're looking at revenue from a subscriber over an annual basis, you're missing all of those kind of leading indicator moments throughout the whole year where they may be deciding if they're going to renew again for next year. And once they churn, it's pretty difficult to get them back. That being said, I think it's also important to note what Tommy was saying about those leading indicators, because the North Star is also in some ways a bit lagging on those input metrics that you're working on a day-to-day. So for example, an experiment you launch may not actually show noticeable change in North Star metric, depending on how large that change you're making is. But you should make sure, to Tommy's point, that those input metrics that you're choosing for an experiment as a success metric actually ladder into that North Star. So you're kind of confident that if you're moving those inputs, that will ultimately affect the North Star metric, and you should see change quarter over quarter, or maybe a monthly basis, but not necessarily on that day-to-day seeing that move.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Go ahead, Tommy.
Oh, I was going to say, I think in balancing kind of the long-term and short-term visions for like how you want to move a North Star metric is also super important. Like you can obviously make, I guess, cheap hacks to juice the numbers on one part of a North Star metric very quickly, but then I'm sure at the end of the day, it's not really the healthy way to actually grow user engagement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I actually think that brings up another point, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying previously about looking at metrics that aren't necessarily directly tied to the North Star. But I think having some idea of what the trade-off metrics for your North Star is also important. So that's another metric that you should be thinking of. So for example, if you are juicing one aspect of your North Star, potentially something else could be suffering. So maybe an example is if you're LinkedIn and you are having some sort of North Star around ad revenue, or so clicks of an ad in a certain session, how is that also affecting the product engagement and the usage of other features that you care about? So making sure that you have a healthy view of what you're kind of compromising for given your North Star as well.
Yeah, I love that. So Abbie, you talked a little bit about experimentation. And without going too much in depth on experimentation, when you're kicking off an experiment, do you set your metrics for the experiment, or do you say, how does this stack in comparison to tracking our North Star metric? Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, for sure. So I actually think the North Star is a helpful tool in helping define what types of experiments you want to run, and then what those success metrics should be. So for example, if your North Star metric, let's say you're Spotify and it's something like time spent listening to songs, maybe you can't move that total metric, but what are the different things that go into that? One aspect of that is getting people to actually come to Spotify, because the more you come, the more hopefully you'll end up listening. Maybe there's something around showing them notifications about new music from an artist that they care about. And that's actually a great input metric for that, coming back to the site and having those ultimately influencing that time spent listening. So maybe your input metric is visits to the site for that experiment. And then you can kind of think through and hypothesize around what are some solutions to that potential problem that you have of getting people to come back. And so it all ties back up to the Northstar metric, but choosing your Northstar metric as that experiment outcome will honestly make it pretty hard to hypothesize experiments that will actually move that in a successful way. And I think when you go and try to detect statistical significance on those experiments, it's going to be quite challenging to get to stat sig on those.
Yeah, I've definitely found like very close customer segmentation when setting up the experiments can be helpful, of like, instead of trying to move like an entire population of users, I've found solace, I guess, in being like, you know what, I'm really targeting this on users of current accounts that haven't logged in a month or two, and they meet a certain either product manager or engineering persona. And like Abbie said, it can be harder to get statistical significance the more you, I guess, cut down your group. But sometimes you can find much more outsized results for like the small target population you want to go for.
Yeah, definitely. So I'd love to allow the audience to take a peek behind the curtain, if you will, into your own Northstar metric. So Abbie, can you go first and describe what you've adopted as a Northstar metric at Amplitude?
Yeah, for sure. So Amplitude's Northstar metric is something we call weekly learning users. And so what that really represents is a user who is active and has created content that 2 other people have consumed in that week. So essentially, it's a measure of learning within the platform. So someone who's creating content, creating an analysis in Amplitude that's worth showing to other people. And it's really a symbol of finding value. It's actually interesting. We changed our Northstar metric recently from weekly querying users to weekly learning users. And really the reason for that was it was representative of basically a shift in product change. And since the Northstar metric should be that statement of product vision or something that you're moving towards, it really meant that we wanted to change our metric to represent our view of really having product be more of a collaborative team sport. And so when we're seeing users sharing out analysis with 2 other people, it's really that representation of kind of going through a build, measure, learn loop of understanding, hey, here is an insight that could help us build a better product and kind of reach our goals as an organization. So shifting our product vision really meant shifting that Northstar metric as well, and then reorienting the teams around that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And Tommy, the metric that you've created here at FullStory is somewhat similar. You want to go into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So our Northstar metric here at FullStory is called Weekly Active Explorers. It's actually the first Northstar metric we've had, but not to say that we weren't also tracking other different things beforehand. But a weekly active explorer is someone who comes into FullStory and completes at least one search or save segment. So someone who's trying to segment or search for customers in some way. Or I think of it as asking FullStory a question and trying to receive an answer. This was also kind of represented a bit of a shift for us as we as we started, we cared more necessarily about people watching sessions or just users coming into the app daily. And we found that, daily usage isn't necessary to get insights out of FullStory. And so we've kind of switched that to the weekly view. And we switched kind of the target action we're trying to move from watching a session to creating a search.
Yeah, that actually relates a lot to kind of that Amplitude shift. Before it was sort of, hey, it's just someone coming in and answering a question. That's kind of what we had with that weekly querying user metric. But now we've kind of taken that even the one step further of saying, okay, just answering the question for us isn't enough. It's actually then sharing that out with the teammate. But it's not to say that weekly querying users wasn't right at the time. It actually was representative of us being in more of a growth mode as a company and trying to actually increase the number of questions that are being answered. And now it's, again, a shift of moving kind of up that chain of now we need to disseminate those learnings amongst different users.
Well, it sounds like I could have some questions about that in a few months then.
Yeah.
So that's great. I have a question from the audience that I think ties in really well here. Kathy asks, who was involved in the creation of the Northstar metrics in your organization?
Sure, I'm happy to go first because I guess I just kind of went through this process from beginning to end. It was definitely product management led. Like I do think product managers are good owners or stewards of product North Star metrics, but it was definitely something that we took around to first and foremost our entire product team, so engineers and designers, but also people like our revenue ops team, our customer success managers, our support. I found it really helpful to get a lot of different buy-in. I think with any type of big change, it's important to have an owner that's pushing it forward, but it's important to have everybody's voice heard. Because there's quite frankly, there's a lot of parts of the app that designers, engineers, customer success managers understand more than I do. So getting all of that input and synthesizing it into one thing, I think was important.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, particularly because I think one of the ways to make a North Star most successful is then to have teams across the organization also really pushing for it themselves. So even, Tommy, to your point about customer success, our customer success managers also look at our North Star metric and treat it as a measure of value that they're getting for their customers as well. So the more people are learning within their accounts, the better it is. So I think getting those voices heard during the process is really important. For us, it was also data science being involved as well. And for us, data science reports through to product, which I think was really key in this process of making sure that everyone is aligned and creating the North Star metric.
Yeah, and that ties in with another question that Kathy had is, how do you work with data scientists or user experience designers and researchers in deciding your North Star metrics? And it sounds like it's a fairly collaborative process.
Definitely.
Yeah,
I'd say a lot of the work I did in choosing like which specific actions or how frequently someone should log into the app, I guess to pick a weekly active explorer, was driven by models that our data science team created. So I was looking at like, where can I get the biggest bang for my buck, I guess, in actions in terms of like scoring like user health.
Yeah, completely. For us, there was definitely a look at, because it does connect into revenue, thinking about how the accounts connected in terms of sharing learnings that most correlate in with that account expansion and revenue driving. And that was definitely data science led in terms of understanding that. In terms of some of the other metrics, because we have Amplitude, we don't have a huge data science team since we can answer our own questions for the most part. So also using, of course, our own products to try to answer these questions.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you talked a little bit about creating these. How did you create buy-in? Like, how did you go about and say like, okay, this is what I think our North Star should be. Do you agree? Yes or no? What was that process like?
I know for me, at least, it definitely wasn't an overnight process. It was kind of something I built up to, kind of starting with like one-on-one meetings with different, I would say, product and customer success people at FullStory. And then really it was, being able to fall back on the data. I mentioned that I tried to tie everything back to kind of like some internal user and customer scores that our data science team has created and already has buy-in to. So being able to tie kind of what I was trying to do from a product team into something that was already accepted was definitely super helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also, again, because the North Star does relate to the product vision, I think a lot of it is also gaining buy-in for that vision of what you think the product should be and how it should look 6 months from now, a year from now. So I think part of it for us was really rallying the organization to a shift around thinking about collaboration around analytics. And so part of it too is the metric kind of follows once you believe in that message of collaboration. Some kind of tactical things we've done, I think it's an ongoing process, but putting up dashboards around the office that show these metrics, continually mentioning them in all hands, like I mentioned before, making them a part of all of the organization's metrics. So for example, customer success, again, having that be a part of their life as well as a professional services team. So really making it important for all teams at Amplitude. And over time, that buy-in also starts to come as it's kind of just continually socialized amongst the organization.
Yeah, that's definitely a great point. Abbie kind of reminded me of one other thing. Like talking about like the product vision, it was definitely thinking about like what parts of my product do I think were very like well competitively positioned, or like what do I think are the real strengths of it. And so it made it easier to like kind of align a metric behind what we already think of as a product strength.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Jake asked in the question box, how does your Northstar metric relate to the mission and vision of your organization? And I know, Abbie, you've talked a little bit about your product vision. What's the connection that you see there between your Northstar and your organizational mission and vision?
Yeah. I think again, it's helping companies build better products, and what does it mean to build a better product? Really, delivering that customer value. And so for us, having a metric that also relates to our customers getting value and actually sharing insights with other people on their team, that's kind of the best way that we've come to be able to measure that. So I think for us as an organization, believing that that's our mission and then aligning the metric to it has been really important.
Yeah, I would probably echo that. You know, trying to tie your Northstar metric to the action that gives your users the most value, or tries to, you know, grade them on who's actually using the product in a way that we meant it to be used. I guess is super helpful and enlightening. And if, you know, if they're not doing this one metric, it's hard for us to, you know, achieve our mission of creating better online experiences.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. So, let's talk a little bit about hurdles, because you guys make it seem really easy. And I'm sure there were some challenges along the way. What challenges do you face in deciding upon a Northstar metric?
One of the first things I found was that like choosing the metric and getting buy-in was certainly hard, but then like projecting out goals was also very hard when you're bringing on a completely new metric. Because like I feel like part of goal setting is first you need to forecast, you know, what will this metric do if we don't do anything? Like maybe that it's going to grow. We're a growing product, acquiring new users all the time. And so, you know, kind of thinking about, okay, getting a new metric and setting a goal so that it actually has a little bit more teeth, or like a little bit more meaning when you present it out at all hands meetings. Was something that I found was difficult when I first got started with it, and probably something I'm still, you know, wrestling with.
Yeah, Abbie, what about you?
Yeah, I'd echo that completely. The forecasting aspect is hard, particularly, let's say your previous Northstar metric or a metric of revenue was something that your team is used to forecasting and has been doing that for a while. With any new metric, you're just not used to what those trends look like. How does that work in terms of seasonality? It's all a little bit of a black box, especially at the beginning. And, you know, just having a new Northstar metric, it's kind of similar to starting from the beginning in terms of that. So really understanding historically how this would have moved, those are all really big challenges. I think one other thing is, again, we mentioned it before, but you're not necessarily going to move the Northstar on a daily basis or even maybe a weekly basis. So what are the successful input metrics that go into that Northstar? You're not always going to be right on what those are. And so I think that there's a level of being comfortable throwing out potential input metrics. You're having to hypothesize around what you think will move that Northstar, and a lot of times it doesn't. So really being flexible with moving on from an input metric or eventually reevaluating your Northstar if you're just not able to figure out how to move it. I think those are all really important things to think about, and definitely setting the metric may be the easiest part.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, is that, I mean, we've talked a little bit about how your business grows and changes. You're going to need new metrics. And even if you have a Northstar, you will want to keep that fresh and relevant. So how do you make that decision to either continue with the Northstar or to change your Northstar and go with something else? Abbie, can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, I mentioned it before, but one thing is that Northstar metrics aren't static. And so reevaluating them, you know, on a quarterly or yearly basis to really make sure that they still align with the vision of where you're trying to go is really important to make sure it's fresh. The Northstar metric kind of represents the strategy as opposed to the strategy necessarily influencing the metric, if that makes sense. So you kind of need to set that strategy first. So if your strategy has changed, then the metric should as well. I also think with those input metrics, again, if you're having a really hard time figuring out how to move the North Star, maybe you need to change the goalpost in terms of picking a metric that's a little bit less lagging to kind of get at it. So I think those are all really important things to think about in terms of refreshing and revising the metric.
Yeah, that's awesome. Tommy, do you have thoughts on that?
I probably echo a lot of what Abbie just said. It's definitely not a black and white thing when it's time to change your North Star metric. I definitely really like the idea of, tying the metric closely to the action users are taking in your app to receive the most value at whatever cadence or whatever action that is. And so, as your product evolves, as the customer segments that you're going after evolves, I think that'll naturally usher in these North Star metric changes.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So you guys both have been through this process of creating a North Star metric. Where do you think someone should start if they are brand new to North Star metrics and they're like, okay, this sounds good. I need this for my product team. What's the first thing they should do?
Yeah, one thing at Amplitude that we like to talk about a lot is figuring out what game your product is playing. So there's kind of three games that we break this out into, and they're essentially attention, transaction, and productivity. And so figuring out which one of those that your product falls into. So attention is essentially where maybe it's something along the lines of a Netflix, where the amount of time your user is actually spending with your product is really important to you. Transaction is more like an Amazon or a Walmart, where you're really trying to tie actual transactions occurring as the value that your product is bringing. And the last one being productivity. I think FullStory and Amplitude would both fall into this bucket of just kind of how many digital tasks are users completing, or those kind of value tied tasks that you're trying to get your users to complete. So figuring out which one of those your product falls into will start to give you hints around what that North Star metric should be. So obviously with attention, probably time spent is really important. Relating to that, transaction would be probably something around successful delivering of goods. And then productivity, it's a bit vaguer, but yeah, again, what is that task that users complete in your product that brings value? So I think just figuring that out and starting to see examples of other companies in your game and what their North Star is, which there's a lot of resources available online, is a really great place to start.
Yeah. Tommy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually, there's a lot of great different info and blog posts out there on North Star metrics. I actually read a lot of the Amplitude ones and thought they were great and were like super helpful and informative to me when I was choosing one. So great job over there, Abbie. But it's also really fun to look.
Can't take full credit for those.
Yeah. It's also really fun, like she said, to look at like all these other examples of different products, North Star metrics, and it's like kind of fun to like weave in like how they fit that product, and then it gives you an idea of like, oh, what would be the best place to start, at least when I think about how my own product should do. It's definitely super helpful when you back up that product choice with data, whether it's user retention or it's a forward indicator of churn or expansion or something like that. But I definitely found that to be helpful to at least give myself a starting point as someone who had never really worked with a North Star metric before.
Yeah, I actually think that's a great point. It's actually helpful to think about a product that isn't yours and kind of go through that exercise of setting, what would Spotify's North Star metric be? What would Amazon's be? Because you kind of get blinders on when you're thinking about your own product and kind of too far into the weeds. So backing up and doing a practice round with some product that you use a lot and are familiar with can kind of help you then reason into your own, I think.
That's sort of related to a question that we got from Benjamin that says, what is your favorite story of another technology using North Star metrics to drive product success? Example, who taught you how to get to the knowledge you have about North Star metrics today?
This may not be, I don't know if it's my favorite success story, but I did read something about LinkedIn with that endorsement feature that they have. So I think originally LinkedIn was looking at just number of endorsements that were being made as a success metric for that feature and for that product. And by the way, if you have a very kind of large, complex product, it may be that you actually need multiple North Stars, or a given product team may have its own sort of miniature North Star that it's looking at. But with that feature, they were looking at just total endorsements. But what they found was recruiters actually were not necessarily trusting that endorsement data because it was just how many endorsements were being made, and there wasn't necessarily data backing up that those were endorsements. So if I say, hey, Tommy is great at product management, do I know Tommy? Have I worked with him before? Now I could probably successfully endorse him, but before that, is that just coming from being friends with someone, for example? So I think over time they started to actually change that feature in the way they built it to actually show how well those two people knew each other and how they knew that that person was skilled in that, and actually targeting people that they think would be relevant to endorse them. So that shift actually changed the strategy to increase the value for that product.
Yeah, that's so great. We had another question that was sort of related. You were talking about how if you're a really big product, you might actually need multiple Northstar metrics. And so this question was, do you see product teams with sub Northstar metrics that roll up into a company Northstar? And Abbie, I think that that's something that you've talked about as well, is how, that you might have different squads who have North Stars that sort of support the overarching North Star. This person says, we have B2C, B2B, and internal facing product teams, data, operations, tools. Any advice on how to handle those?
That's a lot of different factors for sure. Definitely a challenge. Yeah, for us at Amplitude, we actually break things into squads. And so the way that works is that we have different squads that essentially have their own metrics, which are basically input metrics into that North Star. So for example, one pod might be working on activation, which for us is, 5 weekly learning users that we have at an organization in the beginning. That's kind of a symbol of them getting set up for success. And another one might be a broadcasted learning, which is a piece of content that's shared with 2 people. So organizing different squads around those input metrics to the North Star, which essentially become the sub North Star, and the goal for that individual team, is definitely a way to work through that. I think in the case, though, where you have products that may have just completely different North Stars, like, for example, an internal tools team, I would say probably in that case, for that internal team, forming their own North Star that doesn't necessarily need to ladder up to the company North Star is completely okay. The North Star is not effective if it starts to make strategy harder and vision harder and alignment harder. If that's the case, probably you need multiple North Stars.
Yeah. So this has been really helpful. We're going to move on to the Q&A. I know I've been sprinkling those in throughout. So if you're watching and you do have questions, please feel free to type them in the question box. I think, Tommy, this is a good question for you. It is, do you use a squad model to organize teams? Do the squad's North Star metrics feed into the single product North Star metrics?
Yeah, that's definitely a great question. I would say we're starting to experiment with the squad mentality here. As of right now, our engineering and product team is kind of divided into, we call them different subfamilies. And those subfamilies are responsible for everything from actual feature development work, but also the infrastructure that goes in place to support, I guess, the part of the product that team is on. So I guess we've gotten to the point where we now realize that we kind of need feature squads of cross subfamily, different engineers, product managers, and designers to support that. But it's also something that we're still trying to build out and experiment with. As for the North Star metric and the kind of metrics that funnel up to the larger product metric, we're also still kind of working on that right now. I would say that we do focus on those input metrics Abbie was talking about. So maybe a certain squad will be hyper focused on one input metric, but I think we still grade the success a lot on the actual, that it moved the full North Star metric. If we can predict that it will move the input metric correctly that it did, and it didn't move the North Star metric, then I think that's still a success. But that's at least currently how we're organizing around it.
Mm-hmm. One quick hurdle on that I think we found as the number of teams gets larger and the organization gets bigger too, is if you're all kind of measuring towards the North Star, I think it's not too difficult when there aren't that many teams. But one thing we found is the more teams that are specifically focused on moving the North Star, the harder it is to actually attribute change to a given team. And obviously A/B testing should be used, but in some cases you can't A/B test a change. Maybe it's too large of a change, or just it doesn't really make sense in that case to A/B test that particular change. So that's when it can get pretty hard to start to attribute those changes, and then that's maybe a potential when that hurdle starts to come up, thinking about those input metrics that could be different between teams.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So a question from Mark is, thoughts on using NPS as a North Star? Tommy, I know you and I have talked a lot about how your metrics should come from your customers finding success and happiness with your product. What do you think about NPS as a North Star?
Yeah, for sure. So I actually don't have a ton of experience using NPS scores or looking at or operationalizing them. I would say if you feel comfortable that NPS scores for your own customer base are a good predictor of the value that customers are getting from your product, I don't see any reason why that would be a bad North Star metric. I think it all just depends on, do you find them to be a good predictor? I feel like in the past I've heard that, it's either people that are super happy or super angry that fill out these types of surveys. So I don't know if you're missing some in the middle. But I think it depends on your own product and your own customer base.
I think it's actually coming at an interesting time, this question, because we recently actually did a product market fit survey, which is kind of a take on the NPS, but some companies are moving towards this, and we were thinking about which version of this should we do. The product market fit survey it's a different type of question. It's essentially, how disappointed would you be if you couldn't use this product anymore? For some products that might make more sense, like a B2B, how often are you recommending your B2B software to a friend? It may not be necessarily the best metric, but for B2C might make a lot more sense. The one other risk I think about with NPS is, how does that align your organization when you're making product decisions? So can you always answer clearly, like, hey, does this initiative move NPS? Like, maybe, but it could be much more of a gut feeling, as opposed to, hey, does this move daily active explorers or weekly active explorers rather? That might be an easier call to make. But if it's easy for you to make the right product decisions and lead the organization in a direction with NPS, then that's really what the North Star is for.
Yeah, definitely. This is a question from Dustin, who's a UX product design team of one. How do you recommend getting buy-in for a North Star metric? Currently, I create the product, but would like others to see the value. Any advice for Dustin?
Yeah, I think it probably depends on the type of buy-in that you're looking for. I think the biggest potential buy-in can be when you start to show that you're able to move a metric. So if you set a metric and then you prove that you were able to actually have an impact on that metric, that can really get an organization excited when they start to see numbers changing. So almost showing the value by actually moving that metric. So I think that's one way. Then the resources tend to follow when you're able to show impact. That would be one piece of advice.
Yeah, I really like that idea as well. And now that I think back of it, when we were implementing our North Star metric here, it coincided with one of our feature launches for custom events. And we were able to go through how custom events changed every single input metric, and then how it actually rolled up to our North Star metric. And it was cool because it changed it in ways you would expect and we would predict. And so we were like, great, this is kind of like a tool that we can use to judge ourselves and monitor that the changes we're making are having successful impacts. So I agree. Being able to do that kind of simultaneously as kind of getting buy-in and installing it was super powerful, I thought, for people.
That's really awesome.
I think this question kind of goes along with building and seeing results, but Jesse asks, how long was the process to develop your North Star metrics, and how long did it take to build it and then see results from it?
I can start on that one at least. I feel like this was something that it probably took me a good 5 to 6 weeks to do, from reading my first blog post on what is a North Star metric, and actually gathering people in the room and presenting it for the first time, and having the experience of, and this is how the launch affected our North Star metric. Not to say that you definitely couldn't do that faster. Certainly the analysis work can be done quicker. But I feel like with any change management, it's the slowly bringing people on board and gaining momentum behind something, and that was the thing that really took time. and addressing everybody's concerns in one-off fashions when they had them.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'd say, depending on the scale of the organization, that can affect it as well, especially with that change management piece. So definitely a certain amount of time for creating that metric, also a certain amount of time for making sure that your infrastructure is set up to actually track it easily, that you have the reporting that you need, the dashboards that you need, that you're able to then socialize that with other teams, that people understand the definition, even just getting to the point where everyone in a company can actually define your Northstar metric takes some time. So that entire process can definitely take several months. The actual creation of the metric may only take, a month to a couple months, depending on the scale of the organization and the level of involvement from data science.
Yeah, so we're getting near the end of our time together. So I have one last question. I love this question because it's about OKRs, and I think OKRs are a really nice structure to work under. So the question is, do FullStory, Amplitude use OKRs? If so, how do you synthesize a Northstar metric with your OKRs? Abbie, do you guys use OKRs?
So it's interesting that you asked this, because within the past quarter, we've actually started to move away from OKRs.
Okay.
Part of the reason that we have done that is really just to take away a sense of an artificial deadline from certain work and from for certain goals. We definitely do still have quarterly goals in terms of the Northstar metric and the metrics that our teams care about. But I would say that we've empowered the teams themselves to set those cadences a lot more on their own. So for example, a team can say, okay, this is the metric that we're trying to move, and this is how often we're going to check in with leadership on our progress towards it. So for example, for the 2 squads that I work with, we set that to biweekly. But for some teams that their work is a bit, going to take longer to get learnings on in each sort of cycle of that build, measure, learn loop, they've set it to monthly. Or in the case of, let's say rolling out an entirely new permissions model for a company, that might be a quarterly goal in terms of the metric and in terms of that check-in. So we've moved towards giving the teams more autonomy of picking their own time frame, since they're kind of the ones who know best how much they're able to move it. And then we hold ourselves accountable to checking in on those cadences. So that's one reason we've moved away from the OKR, but that doesn't mean we're not still tracking metrics.
Got it.
Yeah, I really like that framework. So FullStory actually does do OKRs right now, and we typically do them in 5-week, I guess, sprints or cycles. We have not incorporated our Northstar metric into an OKR goal yet. That's definitely something that I would like to do, and I'm trying to. Part of it, I think, comes back to like the difficulty I had forecasting at the beginning, or like one of the hurdles I found the Northstar metric was forecasting. And so I feel like I wanted to wait until I felt a little bit more comfortable in forecasting movements for a 5-week period before kind of putting it on a company-wide OKR. But it's definitely something I'm like desperately trying to work towards.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Abbie and Tommy, thank you so much for being with me today to chat about Northstar metrics. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar. I hope this was really insightful. Abbie, if folks want to learn more about Amplitude, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, I would say go to amplitude.com. That's definitely one of the best ways to learn. We also actually do have a great blog where we post a lot about Northstar metrics. So Tommy was mentioning some of the articles that we've shared on there. Those are actually a really great resource to get started. And we're constantly posting new material on there. So definitely one great way to learn more just about this topic and how Amplitude fits into that in general.
Great. And Tommy, best way for people to learn more about FullStory?
I would say likewise, fullstory.com is probably your destination. And we also have a blog that we try to keep updated with kind of like our takes on metrics and how to operationalize data at your company.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.